Good evening and welcome. I think, for one thing, we're a victim of the weather. Too nice to come to a lecture tonight. Well, that's okay, because God knows we need to have balance in our lives, and every night isn't a night for a lecture. But for you who are here, I think we'll make it worth our while. We've had a great discussion earlier today that I hope to extend now. And so we have with us today Dr. Zeni Fox, and to introduce her, I'll invite Sister Lewis Mary.
Well, good evening. It's my privilege to introduce Zeni. Dr. Zeni Fox is a professor of pastoral theology. She earned her M.A. in religious education and her Ph.D. in theology from Fordham University. Dr. Fox has received many awards and is the author of the book, New Ecclesial Ministry, Lay Professionals Serving the Church. In addition to writing many articles and chapters of books, Dr. Fox has lectured frequently on this topic of lay ministry in the church. Dr. Fox believes that Catholic institutions can maintain their Catholic identity when led by laity who are conversant with the traditional language of the Church and more fully in touch with their own experience of God at work in their lives and in the Church. We are hopeful this evening that Dr. Fox's presentation will be a source of encouragement to our lay leaders, that they will be confirmed in their desire to ground their work on life-giving foundations, that lay leaders claim the dignity and power of being called and chosen to carry on the Lord's mission, the Lord and the Church's mission, and that the message we hear this evening will lead to conversation about things that truly matter. Dr. Fox.
Well, hello. It's nice to be here at Dominican. I've been learning a little bit about the story since Father Scott picked me up at the airport, and this beautiful campus on this evening, and I'm glad to be with you and to reflect with you on the whole expansion that has occurred in recent years that I've titled on the outline, Emerging Lay Leadership in the Church. I dialogued about this evening with Sister Catherine Colby and received an invitation from her after, written invitation after our phone dialogue, which had been extensive, as she talked to me about what she thought might be helpful to bring to this evening. And then when I learned the sad news of the sudden loss of Sister Catherine, I realized that those who worked closely with her must still be in mourning, because that is still recent. And Father Scott dialogued further with me as I thought about what I would reflect with you this evening. So the outline is the result of conversations and my thinking and what I call throwing little snippets into a folder for a while until I pull them out and see what thoughts have come, and then try to put them together. So by way of introduction, I'm talking this evening about a great change that has happened in the life of the Church. A change that is really unprecedented since the early days of the Church. This emergence of laity from every walk of life who are engaged in leadership in many arenas in our church. And in order to focus this great change that has taken place, I'm going to give a little bit of historical background, reflect on some key texts from Vatican II, which are printed for you so that will assist you in reflecting with me, and some stories of lay leadership as I look at the situation in the United States today. First of all, some background. At Vatican II, one of the fathers of the Church said, "The laity, what are they for? To pay, to pray, and to obey." You've heard it. Okay. That's true. That really was said. That there really wasn't a sense that the laity had a role certainly not a role of leadership. It just was not seen that way. There is a history of involvement of the laity in the life of the church, but they were men and women of rank, emperors, kings, princes. They had a role, and emperors were crowned by the Pope, and kings were crowned in churches. There was this relationship that was there, but not beyond the ordinary people. One of the key themes in the Protestant Reformation was the emphasis on the role of lay people in the church. And because first Martin Luther and then other of the reformers put an emphasis there, the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church further de-emphasized the role of the laity. It further gave priority to the role of clergy, to the role of bishops, especially bishops, but also of priests. And so they were viewed as the leaders. They were viewed by the people as the leaders. After a while, the theology that is being taught becomes deeply absorbed, and lay people looked upon themselves as not having an active role, became very passive in the life of the church. Now, there is a key exception to this, and that is the story of vowed religious women. Vowed religious women became leaders as they looked at needs and responded to them. They became leaders first with very small enterprises of starting this school or in this house nursing those who were sick. But gradually their small enterprises grew into large institutions, as you know, and the role of leadership that vowed religious in this country and in other places in the world has exercised has been significant. But there's a way in which, and one theologian phrased it this way, that there were parallel orders, that the vowed religious were moving on one road and the hierarchy of the church moving on another road, and that they didn't interact that much. So this change that we have now of great numbers of lay people involved is significant. The changes occurred in my adult lifetime and the adult lifetime of some of you who are present. And if you're younger, it's very hard to really realize the change that has happened, to recognize how different the landscape is today than it was before the council. Even for us who are older, sometimes it's hard to realize. I heard someone saying the other day, I did some phone calling around preparation for this, and he said, you know, it's only when you stop to think about it that you realize how much has happened in the last 30 years and how different the landscape is today. Now, in part, what happens at the council had its seeds of preparation in the time before that, especially in Europe. Some of those seeds were planted a few hundred years ago, most of them in the first half of the 20th century. For example, in the realm of spirituality, in the 17th century, St. Francis de Sales wrote his Introduction to the Devout Life. When I was in school, we all read that. I don't know if people read the Introduction to the Devout Life anymore, but the thing that was striking about it was that it spoke of the spirituality of the everyday, that you find God in your everyday life, in the circumstances of your everyday life. It was not written only for priests, vowed religious, bishops, monks. It was written for everyone with that applicability to ordinary life. So that's a seed. That's one example. But there were other seeds that began to help lay people to think about the spiritual dimensions of their own lives. A very important seed is the work of the theologian Yves Congar in the middle of the 20th century. His book in 1953, Lay People in the Church, was the first study of the role of the laity in the church ever. Now think about that. It was the first study of the role of the laity in the church ever. his book had a great influence on his contemporaries, many of whom were bishops at the council. 53, the council begins in 63, all right, so it has a great influence. And this reflection that he had on the importance of the role of the laity to the mission of the church, the importance of the role of the laity to the work of the church, is very significant. And the third area that I would name would be the lived life of the church. There were a lot of changes that began happening in the first part of the 20th century that flowed out of the writings of someone like Saint Therese of Lisieux, of people like Dorothy Day, the people who talked about the role of everyone in the life of the church, the importance of everyone in the life of the church. They were influenced by Congar, they were influenced by the spirituality that had been growing for a couple hundred years, and they began to emphasize things like the lay apostolate, Catholic action, grows into the Christian family movement, young Catholic workers. And so in the lived life of the church, there are many seeds that are springing into new life, that are bringing lay people to a deeper involvement than they've had in the past. Two things are happening. The laity are changing through what they're doing. They're furthering the life of the church. And the bishops at the council are looking at what's happening and reflecting on what's happening and grappling with, what does this mean? What does it mean that lay people are involved in the way that they are? And so all of these influences impact the council. And I want to underline twice the importance of the lived life of the church, because the lived life of the church today, the changes that are occurring now, will bring about the next definitions that will further shape the life of the church. That what you are doing as priests, as lay people, as deacons, as vowed religious, what you are doing is shaping the next chapter in the church's story. So, the first document, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, almost 50 years ago, was the first document promulgated at the council. And it's quite short, has had enormous influence on the religious imagination of Catholics, has had enormous influence on the consciousness of Catholic people. I don't think we've fully enough appreciated yet the impact of that document. But a few of the key texts. One, that all the faithful should be led to that full, conscious, and active participation in liturgical celebrations. That phrase, full, conscious, and active participation, is repeated 15 times in the document. And the document is one of the smaller ones of the council, just about that size. What this document brings forth includes that the language of the Mass, of the sacramental celebrations, is in the vernacular. Suddenly people can hear in their own language, in the language they use every day, connecting this more to everyday life, connecting it more to where we're rooted in our ethnic communities, in our communities of our language. So the vernacular language. This document brought forth the use of the responses to the priest's prayers in English by the people, the dialogue back and forth between priest and people, emphasis on the active role of the whole assembly, emphasis on the fact that everyone is part of the offering that is taking place, at which the priest is presiding. An introduction of more participatory music, an emphasis on the fact that a choir exists to help everyone to sing. Now, there are times that a choir will sing special things, but the church music is not meant to be simply performance. It's meant to be something that involves the whole congregation. So, excuse me. So, what's happening through the use of the vernacular, through the responses, through the participatory music, is that gradually we are being shaped as a community. We are being shaped as a community into full, active, conscious Catholic people. We're being remolded. Our way of viewing ourselves is changing in this process. We're gradually having a shift in consciousness that says the church is not simply them, as important as they are, the priests, the bishops, and often the vowed religious were the church in the minds of people in the past. But the church is us. We fully share in the life and mission of this church. I have no idea how a sociologist might do this, but I wish a sociologist could do a little study of Catholics to see what is the phrase that has come as a result of the council that is most frequently used. And I think that phrase would be, "We are the church." I think that sense of "we are the church" has entered deeply into the Catholic consciousness. And that's very, very important, very important. For this shift that has occurred. Another text. Servers, readers, commentators, and members of the choir also exercise a genuine liturgical function. For those who serve in these roles, and for those of us who see them serving in these roles, there's a visible representation of the whole community having a part. There's someone who is not the priest representing Christ in a particular way, but a layperson representing the rest of us in a particular way. That these persons are not only about themselves. What's happening in them is significant, certainly, and it's beautifully captured in a document of the bishops called and gifted for the third millennium. If you ever want a simple but very nice document to use with a parish council or a group of catechists, this one, it's old, but it's very good. Listen carefully. Men and women of all ages engage in these ministries, which in turn can be a means of spiritual and religious formation for them. As people study the scriptures that they will proclaim, coordinate musical texts with liturgical seasons, or study Eucharistic theology, they are touched in mind and spirit. So they're naming the lectors, the Eucharistic ministers, the choir members that the council held up for us to consider. Okay? That they are being touched in mind and spirit. And then the bishops go on. Being steeped in word and sacrament is a classic means of transforming the human spirit. The grace of this moment is the transformation of so many laity. I think that's a profound statement. And it reminds us that when people are performing these functions in the community, that it is not only about the job being done, it's about the transformation that's taking place. It's about the growth in holiness that's taking place. And for those of us not performing those roles, they are symbolic for us of the transformation we are invited to at the liturgical celebration. And the last quote from this document: "They ought therefore to discharge their offices with the sincere piety and decorum demanded by so exalted a ministry." And I have italicized that on the page, a ministry, because this is a word that had not been used in Catholic circles. You know, we always spoke about Protestant ministers, and Protestant ministers entered the ministry. But you have to remember, we didn't use those words, that language, that phrase, in Catholic circles. Before, certainly not before the Council, and generally not until the mid-70s, when it begins to emerge as a word, okay? But the result of this shift in language, but also the concept behind it, that lay people can hold these offices, carry out these ministries, brings about what one sociologist called an explosion of ministries, a real change in our worldview. A tiny example. This week, I had an email from a former student, and he asked if I'd be willing to speak at the Knights of Columbus communion breakfast. And he's a layman. And I wrote back and said, I am free that day, and what do you think would be helpful? And he emailed me back and he said, could you talk about the fact that we knights and our families perform lay ministries, and we're not just cheap labor for the church? Now, that's an interesting point that he's making, because he's talking about the difference between just doing a function, even if it's setting up the chairs, and doing something that has a deep meaning, doing something that has something connected with what Jesus did, doing something that's important in the life of the church. And so I think that's what Joe was talking about when he's asked if I'll address this question with the Knights in May. This change in our worldview we can see visually in parishes. What I call a couple of snapshots. You can think of your own, but a couple of snapshots from parish liturgies. Think of the entrance procession. Acolytes, Eucharistic ministers, lectors, the priest. I began my doctoral dissertation in 1986 with a reflection on the entrance procession, because that hadn't existed. We had great processions in my parish sometimes. I remember when a priest was ordained, a new priest came, and this procession from the school to the church outside, half a block and a half. But there were small children in the front from the school carrying flowers. But then came rows of priests and several bishops, and then the newly ordained priests. Those were processions, all right? But here you have a different kind of procession with ordinary folk, changing week by week, young, old, married, not married, men, women, okay. Over time, these roles develop in different kinds of ways. They bring about a new consciousness of our dignity as Christian people. For example, think of the role of usher. In many places, the role of usher has transformed into the ministry of hospitality. And it's shown to be that in various symbolic ways. I was in a church in Florida once. I went down to visit my parents who were vacationing. And it was one of these churches in the round. And when we came to the church, there were men in red jackets with little lapel pins. And at every door, at the head of every aisle, they were welcoming people. Right? They were the ushers. Right? And then, at the time just before communion, when they would help to direct the communion procession, they stood across the back of the church, at the top of the back of each aisle, and then they walked down together. There was a symbolism there that was tangible, right, of their role, the dignity of their role, their place. Now, red jackets and solemn processions, it fit in that community very well. It wouldn't fit in my community of St. Joseph's, but in my community, and people often thought that my pastor, who brought about many changes, that the most miraculous one he brought about was the way he involved the ushers, who liked to stand in the back of the church except the collection. But the ushers led the communion procession. And the communion procession in our church started at the back. The result of that was you had a slow procession led by ushers in each aisle with the people behind them from the back. So that, when sometimes you're in church and some people didn't get out of the pew very quickly and people are kind of racing up the aisle because there are gaps. There are no gaps at St. Joseph's. That there's a much more solemn procession, and it's the ushers who lead that procession. Also the ushers who lead the priest to those who cannot approach the altar because of disability, and they've checked that out ahead of time. And so the elderly, the disabled, they lead the priest to where the person is in the church, that they may receive the Eucharist. So but shifting a sense of the dignity of the role. I want you to, I'm using some of these examples to give a feel for what I'm talking about here in terms of the change. So these ushers now are members of the assembly, like the rest of us, and they welcome other members of the assembly, and they welcome newcomers in ways that are important. An example from what I said on the outline: one family's baptisms and funerals. My sister, Barbara, and her husband, John, belonged to the Christian family movement. And so when my eldest niece was born, as other parents in the movement, they made a banner which was used at the baptism for Amy. And then when her younger sister, 2 years later, was born, again they made a banner. And both banners hung in the living room of my sister's home until her death years later. Christina, the youngest, was born 7 years after Beth. And so Amy and Beth, now 7 and 9, made the banner for Christina, and they carried the banner for Christina. What was happening? From very young, they were becoming active Christians partaking in the assembly. Fast forward to when the oldest girl is 16, and the first of the elders in our family died. My uncle, who was a bachelor and much beloved, he spent much time with all of us. And Amy went to her mother and said, "Do you think that we young people could write the petitions for the funeral?" Now, I must tell you, I was a DRE for 7 years. I should have welcomed this with open arms. The first thing out of my mouth was, "Oh, Barbara, I don't know if she would know how to do that." And Barbara said, "Well, she's been involved in the youth group, and she's been involved in the retreats, and they've been involved in writing the petitions, and she thinks that they would be able to do that." So they indeed did, right? And the priest was open to this. And then they wrote, and each proclaimed in turn the petition that he or she had written. At that point, there were 8 old enough. My mother's funeral a little over a year ago, there were all 10 of them, now 21 years age to 40 years of age, offered a petition. Full, conscious, and active participants, fully expecting that nothing else could be possible. Now, each time something like this happens, I hold my breath a little, because there are priests who are open, and there are priests who might not be. But we have been fortunate in terms of priests being open, and they do it in proper form. So this change in consciousness that has come about, and you can put your own snapshots there. The Constitution on the Church. The Holy Spirit distributes special graces among the faithful of every rank. By these gifts, he makes them fit and ready to undertake various tasks and offices for the renewal and building up of the church. That's the principle, that this is possible. That's taken further. The Constitution on the Church was 64, I think it was proclaimed in 64. In 72, quite some time later, Paul VI wrote, saying that ministries may be committed to lay Christians. This is a fuller embodiment of the principle. They are thus no longer to be regarded as reserved to candidates for the sacrament of orders. And so we have the fact that many of you carry the responsibility for ministries in your parishes, that although not the way Paul VI described it, as a ritual of the church that is universal, that took a detour. That's in a story we won't go into. But this expansion of ministries that has occurred in our time flows from this principle. I teach an Introduction to Pastoral Theology course, and the project they had a couple of weeks ago was to diagram some way that others could look at the ministries in a parish they know well. So it could be the parish of their childhood, the parish that they were living in, or the parish they were serving in some way. And then they shared in groups of 4 what they had done, and then they talked about it as a general group. And some of them were almost breathless with what they had found. Right? that there were parishes had 20 ministries, 30 ministries, 40 ministries. One of the parishes had 71 ministries. Right? And I was reading on the plane the written reports that they've done about this. And again, the little almost gasps are there, because they're saying they're all lay-led. Right? The pastor has only some relationship with everything that's happening, but how could he possibly attend 71 different groups? So their commentary that they're giving on this. So this expansion, that's another vision of church now in 2012 than even in 1980. It's just gone shroom, okay? One way that this happened, I think I understand from way back in the early 80s, when there was a pastor who had a great desire to have Vatican II come to life in his parish, and he was doing a lot to build up the people and their capacities. And he told a story about someone coming to him and saying, you know, we really need an outreach to young adults. When people come back to our community at Christmas, at Easter, at the breaks, to their families, we really need some kind of an outreach to reconnect them to the parish. And Father O'Connor said, you know, I think you are exactly the person who has the gifts to think about how, you laugh, because you know, right there is the call, from the sense of the call, internal call, the internal recognition of a need, and the external call from the pastor, you have the gifts, would you please try to do that? So you've answered those kinds of invitations yourself, so you recognize it. But it is that's the germ of what grows into some parishes that have 71 ministries. In 1980, a sociologist, John Coleman, wrote an article about lay ministry, and he said that there's been an explosion of ministries and no one has yet defined the word. Now that's no longer true, but in 1980 it was true. There was no major work on ministry that we could point to other than the 1976 Bernard Cook's, which most people didn't read because it was about that big. But it was a deeply motivational word. At that time, I was working with interning youth ministers. Very difficult. For many of them, their first job. For many of them, in parishes where they'd never been a layperson in a leadership role and where there was no youth ministry. So they're pushing 3 rocks up a mountain, right? And what kept them going was, this is my ministry. This is what I've been called to do. So I will keep trying. I will hold on. I will continue. I will not throw in the towel. Okay? Very strong, very strong. So this explosion of ministries that we see. One dimension of this, and it's what I talked about this afternoon, so I won't talk too much right now, is the expansion of lay, what the bishops have called lay ecclesial ministry. The DREs, youth ministers, pastoral associates. In 1992, 20,000, full and part-time, mostly full-time, serving on parish staffs. 5 years later, 30,000. It's going up like that. It's pretty much leveled out around 32,000 at this point. In 2000, the number of lay leaders in the parish and ministries surpassed the number of priests in parishes. If you combine part-time priests, and not all priests, but in parishes, part-time priests and full-time priests, part-time lay ministers and lay ecclesial ministers and full-time lay ecclesial ministers, it was 2,000 that the number crossed. Okay? And it continues to somewhat increase with the lay ecclesial ministers and somewhat decrease with the number of priests. I believe that these people are the foot soldiers of the church today, the way that vowed women religious were for centuries, that they are carrying out significant leadership. And I don't mean in any way to diminish the role of the lay ministers, because we don't have a fullness of language here to work with. Because without the lay ministers, the lay ecclesial ministers could not function, just as the priest will say they could not function without lay ministers in general. So, a principle of collegial unity has emerged in the life of the church. The pastor should recognize and promote the dignity and responsibility of the laity in the church. They should use their prudent advice and confidently assign duties to them in the service of the church, leaving them freedom and scope for acting. Cardinal Dulles has said the principle of collegiality was the new dogmatic teaching of the council. And at the council it was applied to the Pope and the bishops. And then after the council it began to be applied to the bishops and their priests. And since then it's applied to the pastors and their people. Principle of collegiality, of working together. And the result of this is so many new structures for shared governance in the church. Before the council, we didn't have pastoral councils. Bishops didn't have pastoral councils. Bishops didn't have finance committees. Pastors didn't have pastoral councils. They didn't have finance committees. There were not diocesan synods. There were not all of the advisory boards that exist today for Catholic education, for Catholic healthcare, for parish life. All of these things that have to do with a collegial spirit that embraces the role of laity and clergy together. All of these structures have emerged since the council. And as the new structures emerge, people take more seriously the responsibility that they are asked to share. There are new organizations and associations led by lay people. I called up the head of the National Federation of Catholic Youth Ministry just to sort through some numbers with him and make sure that I was right. It's lay-led at the level of executive director and the 19-member board. The one exception is the Episcopal advisor. Today, 96% of the dioceses in the country belong to the Federation. Of the diocesan leaders who are members, 4% are priests, 3% are vowed religious, 93% are lay. Every 2 years, this association holds a conference. About 2,500 youth leaders come, all lay. Every second year, they hold a youth conference. 23,000 youth attended the last one, plus there were 18,000 more who participated through live streaming, impacting a tremendous number of lay people. 21% of Catholic parishes have full or part-time youth ministers. About 4,000 of them are full-time, about 4,000 part-time. All lay, virtually all lay, virtually all lay. Our outreach to our young today, is being driven through lay leadership assumed by the Federation, assumed by the diocesan leaders, assumed by the parish leaders as they carry out this ministry of the church. One other example, the National Leadership Roundtable began in 2006. A Fortune 500 chief executive convened a group of other chief executives and leaders from Catholic higher education, Catholic nonprofits, Catholic philanthropy, and said, the church is in trouble. It doesn't know how to manage things. We have all of these messes that are occurring in different dioceses, and the church needs help. What can we do to help? So they formed this roundtable. Some of the things they've done is they've focused on church management. They've developed little booklets that are standards for excellence, for dioceses, for parishes, for nonprofits. They did a tremendous amount of pro bono work, drawing in their people from those Fortune 500 companies to go down to New Orleans and help Bishop Murphy in various ways. They're promulgating best practices. When they identify best practices, they hold them up so that others can copy and follow. they're just piloting, and this one I'm waiting to hear how it works. A 360. That's out of this. My niece was so excited when she heard I was on a committee that was looking at 360, which I'd never heard of. But she's in consulting, all right. But a 360 form of evaluation of priests and members of parish staffs. So they're bringing the gifts of their world to bear on the life of the church. It's leadership emerging in the life of the church. The decree on the apostolate of lay people. This quotation reminds us that our task is not only to build up the church, but to renew the temporal order, which means everything that makes up our world. And that's a particular task of the laity. I feel that this is the area where the leadership has not yet emerged in the same fullness as it has for the building up of the life of the church. I think that this is an area that still needs significant development of our thinking about what would it mean for Catholic teachers to gather together and reflect not on the Catholic schools, which are important, but on the public schools that most of them teach in, and what can be done to strengthen the schools. What could be done to strengthen the motivation of teachers? What could be done, right? What could be done in terms of citizenship? The bishops have their each time there's a major election, they bring out the faithful citizenship statement that they've made. But that's very little worked out in practice in terms of the life of our church. There are many efforts at charity work through our parishes, but relatively little with social justice work, which has to do with transforming the social order, making it more what God has intended it to be. So, I think the Spirit certainly is moving in the church. The Council Fathers experienced that deeply, and many of them afterwards said they'd never had an experience of church like those 3 gatherings over the course of the 3 years, when it was almost tangible that the Spirit was present, shaping the life of the church. It was a moment of revelation of God's action in our midst. But I think that our task is to look today and say, where is that action happening in my parish, in my diocese? When can I celebrate the revelatory action of God shaping us today? And to listen to what invitation is being given to us to further locally and globally shape the church and the world in which the church lives according to the design that God has. So, thank you. The part of speaking to a group that I like the best is when we speak together. So I welcome any insight that you had as you listened, any challenge that you might have, something that I said that you deeply disagree with or even mildly disagree with because of your experience, which isn't the same as mine. Always our experiences are different. Or a question that you might have that you'd like to ask. Father?
Just an observation that I have processed over the past 10 to 15 years. Before a guy gets to be a priest or deacon, he's had X amount of years experience in the church as a layperson.
That's right.
All right. When he gets ordained, he comes out even the parish, as a priest, and maybe he thinks he knows everything, etc. But still, experientially,
that's right.
Layperson, learning some of the difference of being ordained leader within the parish.
Yes, yes, yes.
So I think that is something that once I realized that, I appreciated doing the reflection I had on it. You mentioned statistics and allows ministries within the church. I've done hospital ministry. 30 years ago, there were more priests involved in hospital ministry than laity. Now it's adjusted because of the increasing number of priests.
Yes.
And also, matrimony is being held up higher today.
Yes. I do think that's a factor.
Ordination. And the sense of that vocation is as rich as how we're going to ordain or without religious.
Right.
I respectfully doubt that would taught me 100 years ago.
Thank you for that. So, good. Other observation? Yes, Father Scott.
I want to problematize that just a little bit and talk about the problematic part, because even if a guy is newly ordained, well, a guy who's newly married, you can say, well, he spent X number of years single, and now he's more a single person than he is married. No, things changed, and so you behave differently. And the part of that I really worry about, particularly in the newly ordained, that haven't had time to grow in that, be comfortable in that, is, and particularly, I think we worry about now is the new clericalism.
Yes.
I'm different now, and I'm in charge now.
Right.
And a rising clericalism I see among some of the younger seminarians that I don't see in the older generation.
No. Yes. Yeah.
But what does that, is that real, and what does that owe?
Right.
Lay ministry 10 years down the road.
Yeah. The statistics completely bear out what you said. In 1969, there was a study published by Dean Hoagie, who a sociologist out of Catholic University, who did a lot of analysis of Catholic situations, and it was called The Future of Leadership in the Catholic Church. And in order to examine that, he looked at people in college, and he did the sociological mixes that they know how to do, comparing the students in Catholic colleges, not Catholic colleges, those involved in campus ministry, those not. No matter how he made the mixes, the most conservative single group were those who were considering ordination to priesthood. And the most liberal single group were women considering lay ministry. And I remember reading it and wanting to cry, because at that point I hadn't taught that many seminarians. Now I'm at a seminary 25 years. I've taught a lot of seminarians, but I've taught mostly lay people. And it seemed to me like a kind of a collision course that was being described there. And in fact, it is playing out in terms of those differences. The only hope I have around that is that, especially when someone first comes to a parish, whether they are accepted and loved, even if their behaviors at first are not what one would prefer, if they're wearing a cassock or whatever other thing that is off-putting for many lay people, if they're accepted and loved, they stand a better chance of changing, of growing into what is there in that community. And if not, they stand a better chance of becoming rigid. And so I think it's a two-way street. It's about them, but it's also about us and how we receive. These are the men who have come forward. And quite a number of years ago, I gave a presentation at another seminary. It was literally the worst teaching day of my entire life. They fought me on even my own experience. I mean, disagreed. And it was supposed to be a 5-day workshop. I was the first full day, but there'd been a day of retreat the day before, and the elderly priest from yet a third diocese came to me at lunchtime, and he said, "Dear, please understand, we don't make them this way. They come to us this way, and we're doing our best to change them." And it's the clay that's given, and that's what we work with. That's what the seminary works with, and that's what the parish works with in terms of who comes. So that's where I stand as a person who has borne the hurt of a good number of the lay students, much more than the seminarians. So of that part, okay, of that clash. Yes. A little louder.
Where is the discussion about the spiritual formation for lay ministry?
Okay.
Because I've heard a lot about other issues, but it seems to me that the spiritual formation
Yes.
is the foundation.
Right.
And prayer
Yeah.
and other aspects of our faith.
Yes.
I mean, the Catholic Church is not autonomous.
That's a very important question. And in the conversation this afternoon with some parish staffs and pastors, we talked about the need for what the bishops have named as the 4 dimensions of formation. Intellectual formation, knowing our theological tradition, spiritual formation, being shaped in a spirit of prayer, human formation, learning about oneself, the shadows, the gifts, so as to be able to function better, and the pastoral formation, learning the ways of working in pastoral life, okay? And I would say that at my own seminary, the one that has the most time is spent in the classroom, but the greatest emphasis is on spiritual formation, and a great deal of intentional work done in that area. So that's with seminarians. There are many really fine lay formation programs that follow exactly those same rubrics and also put great emphasis on formation. So, but a very important question. Thank you for it. No. Other comments or yes, Sue.
The emphasis, we were talking about the emphasis of the role of the entire assembly. And I think more work has to be done in the church with regards to this. For so many years, it was them and us. kind of thing. And I don't think people understand the connection with the breaking open the ordinary when they go into the Eucharist, and how important their role is in building the kingdom of God.
Right.
And I think sometimes there's a lot of people who still attend church who think their role is to come in and be spoken to, and they don't understand how important it is in the life of the community. And I appreciate your comments about the role of the
Yes. In some parishes, there's a strong sense of the role of the assembly. In some, it's very weak. But clearly, everywhere we could do more work on it. But I hadn't grasped how far we'd come until maybe 10 years ago. A friend of my mother's died, and I was surprised that the Mass was not going to be in her town. But I took my mother to the funeral, and we got there early, and because I didn't know where I was going. And I'm looking at stuff in the vestibule, and I said, I don't know if this is Catholic. And I went out and looked at the sign, a big sign, Roman Catholic Church. Well, the priest came in alone in the darkest black cope and black vestments that I had ever seen in my life. And there was no other minister who was part of that in any way. He gave the responses to his own prayers. He laid the pall on the casket. He did everything. And the family, nobody read, and this was had been a very involved family, but nobody did anything. So the first thing I did when I got home was call someone from that diocese, and I said, Phil, that Roman Catholic Church? He said, oh, they're in schism. Okay, and I realized, it came as such a shock to my whole system, because we ain't there anymore, anywhere, unless they're in schism. So it's a gradual growth, but I don't disagree with you at all. Okay? Yes.
I would like the group here to know that in my parish we have a brand new priest who only wears a cassock, who only invites the brethren to pray, even after people have pointed this out. I know that he ordered black vestments from Europe because he said you're not supposed to buy them. So we have people
Yes.
who are
Right.
in the past.
Right.
Our music minister has been influenced by this man because when we sang responsorials over the weekend, and I must tell you that I did not, but the cantor would say something, and we were supposed to respond in English and then Latin. We have the Kyrie, we have the Gloria, we have the Sanctus, we have the Agnus Dei. We are returning to the past.
Right. Okay. Okay. All right. That is very painful for many people. But I'd like to say something. They are relatively external signs, and we are not returning to the past. We are not. It is not possible. It is. You cannot take all of the energy of all of the lay people who have been transformed and are engaged in so many places in the mission of the church and continuing the ministry of Jesus. That cannot be undone. It cannot be undone. But it doesn't take away the pain of this. And depending upon how painful it is, people have to decide when they need to follow the dictum of the scriptures that we shake the dust from our sandals and go to a different village. As hard as that is. But based on my experience, that is a very minority reality. More clericalism, I agree, is true, but that dimension, although I find that music leaders everywhere are using more Latin, a sense of holding more of the tradition from the past. So, but, yeah. Yes, Father?
I've got to respond to Pat's statement that
Pat.
should that happen, well-educated laity will bolt and give birth to an underground church.
Yes, right, that's possible.
And those of us educated in
Right.
formation, not servant leader, will
Right.
need to be employed.
Yes, yes, yes. That it is possible, and of course there already is that kind of a church existing in all kinds of ways. But that would be a great sadness. Oh, yes.
In a place like Columbus, where there's so many suburbs, we don't get an underground church without going to St. So-and-so.
Right.
So we have a organized church.
Yeah.
I think we're, but even that's very easy.
Yes, it's painful.
Because this is my home.
Yes. 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 Very painful. Yes.
I spent many years in the military and have noticed in the same time frame the difference in training for junior officers and senior officers, both how they relate to the troops and how they relate to the public. And to some extent, I just wonder if that should be the model for seminaries and for the church right after. Well, if you think of the old school military, I'm the commander and I do what I want to do. The rest of you can, because I got already go get it. And nowadays it's understanding what your sergeants are talking to you about, understanding what the troops are. You're a senior officer, what's your total environment around you, such as both political, your community, and factor that in to your leadership. You still have the authority, and everything goes with it.
Right,
but you
right.
exercise it
In a different way. Yes, yes. There's certainly work that we do at the seminary that tilts in that direction, to emphasize dialogue, to emphasize working with groups. In class in a couple weeks, third-year men, second semester, they will role-play a parish staff, and that's very revelatory to see how they handle that, and then talk with them about that. But that is the hope that we have. But human beings are very complex, and wasn't it Hitler who went to a seminary? Or at least he was Jesuit educated. I mean, it's very complex, the human system. And now and then I see a seminarian whom I worry about, because I don't think that he will succeed in the climate that exists in an active parish with many educated people who think that, well, this is what's good, and look what we've been doing that's good, and why should we do that which we don't think is good, you know. I worry about some of them, but most of them, no. Most of them, I feel they'll be all right. I was more worried 10 years ago. Yeah.
Have you noticed the difference inbound seminarians who have got some experience in the workforce or age-wise, as opposed to inbound seminarians who are going straight out of high school or something like that?
Well, we don't have any. Ours is a graduate school, so they're all finished with college. But those who've been on the workforce, some of them are the more rigid, and some of the younger ones are the less rigid. There's not a distinct pattern that's there. And we also have a tremendous diversity in terms of countries of origin of people coming to us. The largest single group living in the seminary is from Colombia. I made the mistake, I have one class, and people were telling me what country they're from, and the one fellow didn't say, and I said, and Carmine, where are you from? And he said, Nutley. That's a town 3 towns over. but he's Carmine Rizzi, and he has, you know, a very Italian face, and I had him from another country. That's terrible. but we have a great diversity. So. But I first taught sophomores in high school, Catholic high school, and I was doing some work for the diocese with adult catechumenate for confirmation, and I met 2 seminarians, and I asked them to come and speak to my class. And oh, my students loved them. Oh, they were so wonderful. And of course they were young and good looking, that helped, but they were very open and flexible, and you know, and every now and then as a teacher you say something, you don't know where it comes from, but the following week when they were saying how fine they were, I found myself speaking with great passion and telling them it was their job to help them stay that way, and that their love would help them stay that way. And I believe that. And that taught me, that was a long time ago, but that taught me something, that we Catholic people, we put our priests on pedestals that were too high in the past, so that they were not approachable and didn't dialogue with the people, you know. We put them on pedestals that were too high, that parents didn't question their involvement with their children. But we Catholic people did that. We did that. Now, I don't mean, you know, too badly of beating on, but we did. And so now, when young and not so young people come from the seminary, we can love them or not love them. We haven't sold my mother's house yet. She still has the poster hanging that says, our lives are shaped by those who love us, by those who refuse to love us. And for some reason I was thinking about it on the plane, I guess because I'm still working on emptying the house out. But it's true, it's true. So it's true. So, and this morning I had theological reflection, 2 students, and the one, a man of prayer, but he talked so much, and it should have been participatory, and he had so much that was in him he wanted to share, but it should have been participatory. But in part he's Korean, and that's a different structure of instruction and so on, but I'll give him some feedback. But there are the makings of a beautiful priest in him, and he'll be well received in the Korean community, but he'll probably be placed in an English-speaking community. So it's, how do we love each other? How do we love them? So I'm not usually on such a soapbox, but I guess because I taught this morning, they're on my mind. But the lay students, they have dictated a lot of my life. So, yes.
On the matter of renewal of the temporal order,
yes,
specific to the issue of social justice.
Yes.
Parishioners are quite inclined to do the mercy ministries, charitable works, feeding and clothing and all
That's
of
right.
such. But seem to have a much harder time grasping
Right.
the responsibilities of dealing with systemic inequities,
Yes.
those institutional faults
Right.
that fall under that realm of social justice.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on that disconnect and any ideas on how to deal with it?
I think it's very understandable because the issues are so complex. I just heard a study on National Public Radio that says that when people hear about the problems of one person, they want to help. When they hear about the problems of whole groups of people, they want to run away because it's overwhelming. And that's why some charities are being set up nowadays that you help this child. You know, you pay every month for this one. So, very complex and hard to deal with, hard to take on the responsibility. Two, there's some theory of development of faith that suggests that it takes a while to grow into a world consciousness, that it's people of more mature faith, which would include of more mature years, probably over 35, who can grasp the broader connectivity of all of us as human persons. So if you wanted to track that down, it's the work of James Fowler, Stages of Faith. Okay? And the most successful principle I know of is very simply stated. It's a diagram with 2 feet, and one foot is in front of the other. And the first foot is think locally, do things local, connect people with the problem that they can see and touch and feel. Okay, act locally, and then help to think more broadly, globally. So the 2 feet. So the first one has to move forward locally, okay, and then growth can occur. But it seems to me, certainly right now, you know this is true, the social justice ministry is probably the smallest group in the church. The food pantry ministry, the catechetical ministry, all of these ministries are much bigger and more robust. The social justice ministry in most places struggles along. All right? One very successful model is just faith. And it was begun in a parish, became very successful, spread to other parishes, and now has been taken over by Catholic charities. Or is it Campaign for Human Development? Whoops, I'm sure it's Catholic Charities. But Jezreel, Jezreel, is the person who began it, and now he does workshops all over the country with parishes. It's the most successful single model that I know of for engaging parish groups. Okay. Beyond the Catholic circle, Bread for the World, now, what is it, running 30 years at this point, is a very successful model for engaging people in hunger issues. Okay. Okay. I think this crowd, yes, Scott, is winding down, but go ahead.
I want to return to something that I agree with you on, but I want it to be more than words of hope. Put some meat behind it about how that genie's not going back and not follow. Like lay ministry, we can't go back. We just can't. I hope that, I believe that, but I want give me some facts to hang that on.
Okay. Well, at its most minimum, it means that the good that's been done can't be undone, and the changes that have come in the persons who've done the good can't be undone. That's at the most minimum. But in terms of the continuation, when people can't do something that they've been doing because the stricture occurred, they move into another place. This is not quite an example, but I had a student years ago who was a youth minister, and she did a certificate with us because she didn't have a BA. And as a result of that, she decided she wanted to do more work. You know, it's hard when you have young children and you go and do a BA, but she did the whole BA. Then she did the master's. Then she moved into hospital chaplaincy, and she's now the head of chaplaincy at one of the Catholic hospitals in our area. The gifts that are developed expand into other places and do good in other ways. She wasn't forced out of youth ministry, but she could have been. You know, that happens. Parishes decide we can't afford, or we don't want, or whatever, or that's not the person we want. But, you know, people, I believe that. It's belief. I can't give you proof of that. But the story, what I watch, right, But secondly, in an absolute sense, everything that has developed in the course of the church in the United States as a participatory church could disappear. But all the forces are bending toward participation. The world forces are all bending toward everything. Look at the revolutions. What is that phrase? The arc of history bends in a certain direction, right? And it bends toward participation, more in our time than any other time. So I just don't think that it can go away. In Pat's parish, Pat, was it? Yeah. It might go away. And the parish, the numbers will diminish, and the collection will suffer, and the priest will become discouraged and never really understand what happened. But I watched a parish. The priest was the head of pastoral planning in his diocese, and as he looked at the numbers, he said, we're going to be single priest parishes in the next 10 years. So he said to the bishop, would you give me a parish by myself? I want to show that you can be a single. Back then in the Northeast, there were no single priest parishes. They didn't exist. So he wanted to show what you could do. And he did a wonderful job developing people, empowering people. And then he was retiring, and he asked me to come, would I come and do a day with the people to prepare them. So I spent a half a day beforehand with him about what his hopes were, et cetera, and I built a day in which the people looked back at what had been done and where they were now and what their hopes were the future. It was beautiful. I loved it. I loved them. One of the people on the staff I taught, forgive me, former military, but they sent in a military man, and within a year, everybody on the staff was gone. And within a couple of years, all of the structures were falling apart, and the numbers had diminished greatly, and the collection was way down. It was one of the plum parishes, but it didn't stay plum. And that will happen, and it's painful. But all around, it's flourishing. We heard the stories today from the priests who were here. It's flourishing, right? Yeah, and it's not going to get undone. No. That's what I think I believe it more than I know it. I think I hope it more than I know it, as a long-term arc. And the fact that the bishops have declared that the lay ministry is a work of the Spirit, that has to be waved around a lot, and has to be thought about a lot. That it's not the whim of any one person that we can bend to here, and people have to be strong. I'm not so good at strong, but I try. but I do. Sharon.
It's just a wondering for me about this question of going back and how that's not possible. What's our role in that?
Mm-hmm.
It's striking me that at one point in my life, I grew up in this church that provided this structure and tradition and ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And I was drawn into that. And then Vatican II kind of opened up the space where I had a greater room to move in. And there was an invitation to move in and claim one's gifts. And when I reflect on current priests who are seminarians for information, or even young adults who are looking at how do I use my gifts in the church, part of their culture has been a different kind of. They've grown up in a clergy abuse and scandals and lowering numbers of clergy. And so in a way it's kind of like I see them going, I'm just wondering about it. I need to kind of protect this place of the church that I love because I was mentored by another priest or another lay person. And my own challenge is recoil from
Right,
that.
right,
Because
yes.
then you take away
Yes.
the very opportunity I had
Right.
to be invited into the space.
Right,
Now,
yes.
I haven't always appreciated it. Sometimes I wanted to be invited into this space and not that one. And
Yeah.
I had to grapple with that. But
Right.
I look at some of our young adults and I'm kind of like the life that they've grown up in has had a very different set of
Right,
boundaries
yes.
and freedom
Yes.
that are very different from
Right.
what I grew up in. And I'm wondering about that. Sometimes I become very judgmental of that action. And what I do is go, well, I'm not having any of that, and I move away. But I leave them in this place of
Right.
rigidity and
Right.
no dialogue. And so part of my challenge is not only the ministry of the temporal
Yes.
order, but to stay present
Right.
in those places
Yes,
where
yes.
I go. You know, it's Chardin's prayer of trusting in the slow work of God. God's working in them. As
Right.
long as God, you know, so
Yes.
I
Yes.
guess it's that challenge of,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
the judgments we place, and
Yeah.
I'm very guilty of that.
Yeah.
And how do we stay surrounded, just like we need those four, you know, those kind of four aspects of formation. Young clergy, young
Yeah.
laity, young,
Right.
the movements in the church today
Right.
need to be surrounded by people that can tell the story and
Yes.
invite them into a different kind of space.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've always been
Yeah.
invited there.
Yeah. Your remarks remind me, Sharon, that the church has, it's been called a big umbrella, a big tent. You know, there are so many differences. Among lay ministers, there are some who are studying at Steubenville that I've heard pastors say, I will never hire anyone from there. All right? That they are drawn to something other than what other young people are drawn to. I for the first time, I did some work last semester on the movements, and I really was amazed at the diversity of the movements, and that their part, I believe very firmly that the same principles that I outlined from Vatican II that brought forth lay ecclesial ministry has brought forth the movements of Focolare and San Egidio, etc., has brought these forth, all so different. And what I reminded myself just today, I love flowers, and the diversity of flowers is so incredible. And it must be that God wants us to see that diversity, and then that diversity exists in the human community. It exists. The pastors were talking about the parishes are different depending upon the stuff of the parish and the pastor who's there and what their vision is. And so groups of people are different. And your sense of opening out and staying in conversation, I think that's very helpful. Very helpful. It's hard to do. It's hard to do. It's hard to do. So, but okay. Well, thank you for a wonderful evening. And I clap for you.